You're all aware that the rise of China is generally seen as a defining feature of the geopolitical landscape of the 21st century, and I know particularly those of you who are our master's students are well aware of that. But I think in the general media, everybody's well aware of the rise of China as the defining feature of this century. Those of you who follow the debate more closely will know that in Australia, it has centred around a couple of rather more extreme views, and I'm using shorthand here in terms of the time available. On the one hand, we have a view that China already has primacy and the United States should accommodate China and acknowledge that primacy, and that we should have second thoughts about our alliance with the United States. The other one is a lot more extreme, but you've seen it in the press and elsewhere in recent months, and that is that Australia should develop the military capability to tear an arm off China, and I can hardly keep my face straight as to what a quaint, ridiculous and dangerous proposition that is. And that line of thought also talks about us developing the capabilities to decapitate the Chinese leadership. Well, you know, really easy, isn't it? It's only a country of 1.2 billion people, piece of cake. Dangerous points of view. I have a different view. I see a China with serious weaknesses, and there are people here who know a lot more about China than I do, and I stand here to be contradicted. But I think we're in the danger, and our American colleagues are in the danger of seeing China as the next Soviet Union, and demonstrably it is not in terms of military power. I'm also of the view, and this may surprise you given America's current economic crisis, which is not to be dismissed, I think the United States is enormously innovative and inventive and dynamic society, and I think it has enormous and tremendous reservoirs of power to bounce back. But again, you could well challenge me on that issue. So that's the sort of theme I'm taking. I think it is time for a more measured and robust debate. I'm going to explore three things with you. First, and very briefly and very crudely, and I know many of you will be across the literature on this, and that is, what are the competing theories about the rise and fall of great powers, and the theories of what happens when great powers collide. Secondly, let's again very crudely look at some of the strengths and weaknesses of both the United States and China. And finally, I want to talk a bit about a pet topic of mine, and that is what sort of regional security architecture will be best to moderate these two giants, and can we envisage a regional security architecture that helps them to avoid conflict and confrontation. So that's the outline of what I'm about. So as to the first one, the theories about the rise and fall of great powers. You all know that the traditional view about a rising new power like China competing against a status quo established power like the United States, historically, the historical record shows that such powers, a rising power, confronting an established power, go to conflict. And the obvious model, of course, is Germany in the Second World War and Imperial Japan also in the Second World War. You can think of many other examples, but like all examples in international relations, there are exceptions. And of course the exception that the historians often raise is that the United Kingdom did not go to war as the established power with the rising power, the United States. And the explanation for that is often, well, they were both democracies. And that the track record of authoritarian powers is not so good at all. Some of you will have read the book over 20 years ago by Paul Kennedy, very famous book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. It was published in the late 80s. His final chapter was called The Coming Decline of the United States. And here we are over 20 years later, and it hasn't yet happened. By the way, his penultimate chapter, in which he footnoted the book I wrote on the Soviet Union extensively, he did not even see the limits to the Soviet Union that I saw. The essence of Kennedy's thesis, as I recall it, was that at the absolute core of great power is economic power. That gives you military power, and it gives you all sorts of other associated powers to do with your economy and its strength. And again, you see, whilst one is attracted to that explanatory variable, whether it was the rise of Germany and Japan or the current rise of Japan in the 60s and 70s and China now, that economics explains it all, and you need a big successful economy. Let me put it to you, the Soviet Union did not have a big successful economy. It had a fragile, centrally planned economy that poured 20% of its gross domestic product into the military. So, you know, the exceptions always challenge the rule. Some of you may have read a book by Amy Chua. She's Professor of Law at the Yale Law School. It's called The Day of Empire, How Hyperpowers Rise to Global Dominance and How They Fall. And she has a particular definition of hyperpowers, and she includes the Roman Empire, the Persian Empire, and particular aspects of the Chinese Empire, I think, in the Tang Dynasty. Anyway, she has an interesting and quite difficult concept in which her explanatory variable is not economics. It's what she calls tolerance and intolerance, that successful hyperpowers are tolerant on the way up and intolerant on the way down. Well, you know, I might put it to you that China right now is not one of the most tolerant of powers, and neither is the United States, so we've got a slight problem. Some of you will have read the works by Niall Ferguson. In his 2010 Bonython lecture, Empires on the Edge of Chaos, the Nasky Fiscal Arithmetic of Imperial Decline, he argues that imperial falls are nearly always associated with fiscal crises, with sharp imbalance between revenues and expenditures, and above all, with the mounting cost of servicing, wait for it, a huge and rising public debt. Now here we have America right in that situation. And he makes the point that the Spanish Empire declined after the bill on its debt reached 100% of its annual ordinary revenue in 1598. Imperial France fell after interest payments reached 62% of annual revenue in 1788. Ottoman Turkey began its decline after interest payments on its public debt hit 50% in 1877. And now here comes Niall Ferguson's real point. The current United States debt is set to reach 146% of GDP by 2020 unless there is radical surgery. And the figure I hold in mind is, I think some of you know, the United States defense budget is about $700 billion US, a non-trivial figure, and that the interest on America's public debt will exceed the absolute figure of the American defense budget by about 2015, unless something serious is done. And you see already there are some minor cuts in the American defense budget being talked about. And then we have some rather silly views. One, Arvind Subramanian in the current September-October edition of Foreign Affairs, who argues that one day, sometime soon, China will control so much of American Treasury bonds that it will demand that an IMF bailout is necessary as a precondition for the withdrawal of the American Pacific Fleet. Well, I don't know what areas of government he's ever worked in, but great powers, even on the way down, don't destroy their Pacific Fleet. It's called going to war, I'm afraid. But these are some of the sillier views we're getting. My view is that the 21st century will, obviously economics, GDP, geography, population are elements of power, but I think one of the defining variables will be high technology and innovation. Things like nanotechnology, biotechnology, and quantum computing. And in that area, the Americans are so far ahead of China right now, it's not funny. And the same applies in the military area, by and large. So let's move secondly to the strengths and weaknesses of China and the United States. And I say there are people in this room know much more about China domestic situation than me. China and the United States are two great continental powers. Large land area, large population. Both of them in different ways historically have seen themselves as exceptional, if not God-given. You're all well aware of America's description of itself as the exceptional country, the light on the hill. China, the mandate of heaven, the central kingdom, and so on. Moving to China, you will well know that it's only in the last 200 or so years, a little bit more, that China has not had the world's largest economy. The historical record that we have shows that before the era of European conquest of Asia in the 1500s, that China and India had the world's first and second largest economies. And it's only been since the European Industrial Revolution and the rise of America that that situation has been displaced. So for China, it's a short period of a hiccup in the period of 3,000 years as a unified state. The strength of China's economy is quite remarkable. The first time I went to China was in 1978 as Deputy Head of Defence Intelligence. I was a guest of the PLA Foreign Affairs Bureau, so-called. And I remember going to Shanghai, that wonderful city on the Bund, and at Pudong there was nothing. And I was the first Westerner to go on board a Chinese submarine and visit the submarine building yard in Shanghai. And you may well ask why. It was the beginning, 3 years after the Cultural Revolution, of opening up and some, frankly, military transparency in those days that is better than it is not now in China. The Chinese economy recently has overtaken that of Japan. As you well know, it's the second largest economy in the world. It's still a long way behind the United States. When the Chinese economy in gross terms will overtake that of the United States depends upon whether you use exchange rates or what's called purchasing power equivalent, what you get for your dollar. And some people are saying 2018, some people are saying 2025 or 2030. It doesn't mean to say, of course, the standard of living and the R&D and, if you like, economic throw weight will be the same. But you're living through a period in which the most remarkable transformation in the geopolitical balance is taking place, based on this incredible openness of the Chinese economy since Deng Xiaoping started it in 1978. Compared with some other great powers, China is relatively homogeneous in terms of its cultural makeup. It has a powerful vision of itself. Unlike the former Soviet Union, my personal view is you can't accuse the Chinese of not having a work ethic. Demonstrably they do. Henry Kissinger, in his most recent book, published just a few weeks ago, called On China, it's marvellous, isn't it, when you get to Kissinger's status, you produce a book called, one word, diplomacy. You produce a book in which his name is bigger than the title of the book on China. I wish. He talks in his first chapter about the singularity of China. And for me, not being a China expert, it is an awkward chapter. He tries to explain the difference between the Western concept of chess, which is conflict and winning, and the game which I can't remember in Chinese, but which in Japanese is called Go, and that the concept of winning and losing is much more sophisticated. Kissinger argues in this first chapter that unlike other historical empires that have come and gone, China boasts a unique history of cultural and political continuity, and that secondly, the foundation of this remarkable continuity lies not in violence or the use of force, but rather in an exceptional cultural heritage, the Confucian value system, which is aimed at domestic and global harmony rather than conflict. Well, that's an interesting proposition. And I find I've not fully read or finished the book, but there are things where Kissinger is so pro-Chinese that based on the evidence, it's not accurate. And I can speak from personal experience. his chapter on when China taught Vietnam a lesson. Now, that's an interesting phrase from a country that doesn't use force and isn't a hegemonic power. When China taught a fellow communist country a lesson, and there are people in this audience who were with me in defence intelligence at the time, Kissinger argues that China won. No, it didn't. We watched the 4 Chinese divisions come across. We watched them in detail, and we watched them try and beat a Vietnamese division, and they did not win. Kissinger has the same problem with the division size battle on the Ussuri River in Soviet Siberia, in which he claims the Chinese won, and I'm afraid the intelligence evidence that he surely has access to, it shows the opposite. Well, no book is perfect. The issue of China's economy, when I talk to economic friends, I've got a particular friend called John Lee, some of you know, in the Centre for Independent Studies. He wrote an article in, I think, the Financial Review recently, in which he talked about the structural imbalances, the danger of a housing bubble boom that would burst. He talked about the overinvestment in fixed investment for no particular purposes. And some people are arguing that rather than the Chinese economy just slowing from a mere 10% per annum, which it has grown by, give or take, for each year of the last 30 years, that it will slow to 7%, which is what is in the current Chinese 5-year plan. Some people are arguing that it may peak and begin to slow or even stall. If it stalls as a result of this second round of the Western capitalist world global financial crisis, we will all suffer, and by the way, not least this country. My information is that China's demographic situation is not brilliant. By 2015, the workforce in China will peak and start to contract because of the one-child policy. And by 2050, fully 450 million Chinese will be over the age of 60. Don't tell me there aren't geopolitical implications of that. Demonstrably there are. And I won't go on about corruption in China, which Hu Jintao knows is a problem, environmental issues and so on. But I will go on about something I know particularly well, and that's China's military. We're in danger of drumming up China as the next Soviet Union. And let me repeat once again, China now is nowhere near what the Soviet Union was at the same period from its revolution. This is the 62nd year of the Chinese Revolution. In the 62nd year of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1979, the Soviet Union had 12,000 strategic warheads, nuclear warheads. How many does China have? 200. The Soviet Union had nearly 300 submarines. How many does China have? 60. 27 of those are obsolete, and one could go on at length. It is not in the same ballgame. But there is a danger, including the United States, as usual, that for the self-serving purposes of the Pentagon, there is an inclination to drum up China as the next military power. I think China does have some capabilities. That wouldn't surprise me. Having suffered a century of humiliation, having now got economic power, the amazing thing is that China didn't develop military power earlier. It was the fourth of the 4 modernizations until recently. And even now, the figures show that China spends more on domestic security, marginally, than on defence. Let's say the following things about China. Currently, in my view, it is a second-rate military power. It is nowhere near the American military power, so why should America accommodate it in terms of there is no primacy? It has no experience of modern combat whatsoever. And let's not pretend that the Korean War and teaching Vietnam were lessons in modern combat. America's had year after year of modern combat experience. And whether you like it or not, Iraq, Afghanistan, the first Gulf War, Libya. The Pentagon report acknowledges that substantial parts of the Chinese military equipment is obsolescent, old Russian equipment. That it still reverse engineers much Russian equipment. That after 30 years of trying, China can't even develop, after 30 years, a military jet engine, and it relies on the Russian military jet engines, which those of us who specialised in that subject knew only too well were high rate of wear engines. Chinese anti-submarine warfare is not in the same category as ours in the West. And, you know, I could go on a lot more. It is true that in cyber warfare, China has made important advances. It is true that in the capacity to target American aircraft carrier battle groups with ballistic missiles, it's making some remarkable progress. And you may want to raise in question time how America would react to being targeted by such a weapon system. America certainly would not sit back and fold its arms. So my view is that China still is a second-rate military power, making important progress in key areas like ballistic missiles and cyber, but that it is not, and demonstrably is not, the former Soviet Union. The Pentagon report says that by 2020, it may be that China has a modern, regionally focused military capability, but of course it makes no measures against what the United States and its allies will have. It does acknowledge that China will be unlikely to project substantial military forces distanced from China in the foreseeable future. However, and there are always howevers in strategic affairs, there is no doubt, and this has to be acknowledged, as a result of the global financial crisis, America's reputation for leadership, as a result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and by the way, America on and off has been in the Middle East now longer than it was in both the First and Second World Wars, longer. And that the inability to decisively win in Afghanistan, and most particularly the global financial crisis, who would have believed 20 years after defeating Soviet communism that the United States would be now in this pickle of rampant capitalism out of control? And I think as a result of that, there is a perception that China is on the rise, and we've seen in the last 18 months to 2 years, China take some military-related advantage of this growing power. Its threats to Japan in the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, its threats with regard to its core interest of owning the entirety of the South China Sea, its most recent challenge, only a few weeks ago, of an Indian amphibious ship leaving Vietnam. So there are some issues here about the rules of the game and norms of international behaviour on the high seas. And I think there is a risk of an incident on the high seas. And if there is one, by the way, I know who will lose. And it won't be the United States. What about China's strengths and weaknesses in Asia? It has enormous strengths. Unlike America, it is located in Asia. It has 5,000 years of history in Asia. It has the sort of soft power influence that the former Soviet Union, for instance, never had. A diaspora of overseas Chinese who it looks to in terms of influence and money in a way that the Soviet Union never had. And important contacts in Asia over many centuries. Some of those are contacts like its 1,000-year dominance of Vietnam that leads to difficult relations. When you look at, however, at China's important friends and allies, who are they? Well, they are a country called North Korea, which is hardly one of the most brilliant, successful countries in the world. A liability rather than something that you would like to have. Then it has Myanmar, well, a country of no particular importance in Southeast Asia run by the military. And then it has Pakistan, which has been aided by China with regard to its nuclear capacity. And that's about it, isn't it? That is about it. So, no experience of modern combat, a second-rate military capability that is developing, and a bunch of allies that frankly don't amount to much. There's a slight exaggeration here, but I think you get the general point. But as our white paper of 2009 says, and I don't agree with everything that's in it by any means, as you'll hear me say in a minute, the Rudd white paper argues that by 2030 China will be the strongest military power in Asia and by a considerable margin. It then goes on to say that in the event that a major power adversary operates militarily against us in our northern approaches, we shall develop the military capability to impose substantial military costs on that power. There's another dangerous, ambitious capability that has not been thought through. Let's turn to the United States. Remember how I said this is a country that sees itself as the exceptional power, the light on the hill? I think we Australians often don't understand the Americans just because they speak a quaint form of English. They're an entirely different country in scale and origins from us, the Pilgrim Fathers, the role of religion, all those things that never occurred here in this society. But they do see themselves as exceptional. You saw that in the Monroe Doctrine and the Western Hemisphere. You saw that when they threw their weight eventually and late into the First World War, and more importantly late and eventually into the Second World War, they won. When we talk about democracies being careful about the use of military force, who dropped 2 nuclear weapons on Japan? The only time it's ever been done. Never underrate democracies when they get their temper up, and China should think about that. I don't agree with those in America who say that they saw the Soviet Union off. The Soviet Union saw itself off, and I'm going to talk about that in another public lecture on the 7th of November. But look at the strengths of the American economy. It's still the largest economy in the world, accounting for about 25% of world GDP. It accounts for half of world military expenditure. Let me repeat that. It accounts for half of world military expenditure, about $700 billion US dollars. China's expenditure, by the way, it claims, is $90 billion. I've yet to meet any communist country that tells the truth about its defence budget, and let me tell you what the Chinese defence budget does not include. It doesn't include military procurement, doesn't include military pensions, it doesn't include the armed militia and police, it doesn't include a whole bunch of things. So, what do we think? What does the Pentagon think that, and the IISS in London think that China spends on military? About 150 billion. That's a long way behind the United States. If you want a figure that's my guesstimate, when you're looking at advanced military research and development, and I don't mean ordinary things, I mean the real high technology cutting edge stuff, do you know what percentage of world advanced military research and development America accounts for? How about 90%? Who are the others? Well, it ain't China and it ain't the former Soviet Union. There's a bit in the UK and there's a bit in France and there's not a lot else. Its demographics, unlike that of China, is not one of an ageing population due to the one-child policy. It is a dynamic, youthful, growing population, largely due to Latino immigration and growth. And it's like that of no other great power except that of India. It too, like China, has an incredible work ethic, and I've stressed the issue of American innovation. Ask yourself, which have been the major successful world companies in the last 3 decades? They're all American. How about Apple, Microsoft, Google, Facebook? You go on and on and on. Apple recently, momentarily, was the biggest capitalized company in the world. When you talk about the things I mentioned, like biotechnology, nanotechnology, and quantum computing, the Americans are really seriously in front, in my view. Its weaknesses are obvious. Who would have believed they would have brought, in a self-fulfilling wish onto themselves, the collapse of larger elements of the economy due to what I can only call cowboy capitalism? The indulgence with regard to banks and financial institutions and things I don't understand like derivatives and so on. And they've brought that on themselves, and I think the concern is America going to pull itself out of this, what we call the GFC, the global financial crisis, or are we bordering on another one? And if that happens, there will be some very serious geopolitical issues, which I'll come to at the very end. The question is whether these issues are enduring and abiding in the American economy, or whether, as in the past, they will bounce out of it, as they did in the Great Depression. We will need to ask whether it will have a serious impact on the American military. At present, I don't, as a former defence planner, think that knocking $300 billion over 10 years is a big impost for America. That's the current issue. Works out at 5% of the defence budget. Given the waste in all defence budgets, blind Freddy can say 5%. The question will become if the budget cuts cut harder. Kim Beazley, my former boss, who's now our ambassador in Washington, as you know, was Chancellor of this eminent university, was in the Financial Review last week in typical Kim fashion saying, never mind this closing gap between China and American military capability, says Kimbo, the bomber, the gap is widening. America is racing ahead. And frankly, given his long security clearances at the highest level that he and I shared for many years, he should know what's going on, but I haven't talked to him about it. What about America's strengths and weaknesses in Asia? We mentioned China. America sees itself, and always has, since at least the wars with Spain and when it colonized, let's remember, the Philippines, as an Asian power. But it is not of Asia. It's not in Asia in that sense. But it has a web of alliances and friends, the like of which China simply does not have. And you remember I reeled off North Korea, Myanmar and Pakistan. Well, on the other side of the ledger, we have some of the world's other greatest successful economies. Japan, going through a long period of stagnation, still a very vibrant economy with a significant military. Japan, South Korea, the ASEAN countries. To a greater or less extent, they're either allies or friends of the United States. There is, in addition, from America's point of view, growing concern in some of those countries I've mentioned about growing Chinese assertiveness, the sort of things China's been doing in the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea and the South China Sea. So what has happened? Japan, contrary to views that when a left-wing government came into power in Japan, it would move away from the alliance, it is moving closer. And things like Futenma on Okinawa and the Marine base are being settled. South Korea has also, in my view, moved closer to the United States because of China's casual attitude to what its great ally North Korea did, sinking a South Korean warship and then shelling a South Korean island. By the way, in my book, sinking a warship is an act of war that demands a response. And, you know, I think South Korea has been enormously restrained. Even the ASEAN countries of Southeast Asia, some in particular, like Vietnam, are offering America use of facilities and bases. They're buying Russian submarines, Kilo class, very quiet, relatively speaking. And they're obviously designed in response to China. And you've seen that in other acquisitions in our region. The weaknesses of America, we all know. Its distractions in the last 10 years, the since so-called 9/11, a phrase I hate, by the way. Its distraction fighting the so-called war on terror, its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, have distracted it from the rise of China and the shift in the geopolitical balance. And what I now want to see is America refocusing. It, like us, is doing a force posture review, which will have another look at the American bases at Futenma and Yokosuka in Japan, but there will be no pull-out. There will be some reinvigoration of capabilities in Guam, and I expect you will soon hear some announcement concerning greater American use of facilities in Australia. My view of the United States by 2030 is that it's still going to be the world's dominant power, the only power that has global military capability. But if they continue to get their economy wrong, Paul Dibb is wrong. I suppose no matter what you think about my very rough-hand description, my conclusion is that whether it's China, the rise and rise and rise, like no other power I've ever seen, or whether it's the United States, the decline, 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 that keeps being predicted and never happens, beware straight line extrapolations. We did it on the former Soviet Union, we did it on Japan, and we're doing it again on both China and the United States. So, thirdly, what sort of regional security architectures could we conceive of that might be best to moderate these two giants, China and the United States, so they can live together in peace and harmony, or as the Chinese quaintly say, a harmonious country in a harmonious region in a harmonious world. Yeah, right. The big question of our time, and particularly the younger ones here who will be around to see what China looks like in 2050 or 2060, is, and it's a big question of our time, and not least for us in Australia. We're not parked off in Europe or across the Pacific in the United States. We're a small country with a small defence force located in Asia. And we've never in the past, in our short 200-year history, been faced with our major economic partner not being our major ally. Think about it. From 1788, when the First Fleet settled this country, through to when Japan attacked Australian forces in Singapore, we depended upon the United States for our military protection. And it was our greatest trade and investment power. By the way, the United Kingdom is still the second largest accumulative investor in Australia after the United States. And from 1942, when John Curtin said without regret that he returned now to the United States, we've depended on the United States, which until a few years ago was our biggest economic overall trade power, imports plus exports. Now we've got this bifurcation. And some are arguing that we will not be able to manage both things together. That is the crucial alliance with the United States and a growing and expanding economic relationship with China. So I guess, to use an old farming expression, we'll have to straddle the barbed wire fence and see if we can make it work without it hurting too much. But it's going to be very difficult, I think. The question of our time is, will there be a collision between these two powers? You remember the rising ambitious power that naturally needs its place in the sun, given the sad history of China in the 19th century and later, and the United States that has now been accustomed for a long time to being the world dominant power. You remember I said that history tells us, yes, there is a high risk of conflict, but perhaps I should not be so pessimistic. So, what moderated mechanisms geopolitically can we envisage? So there are three that I'm going to talk about, and there's one other that I should talk about, but I won't. And again, I'll be very crude. First of all, there's a traditional balance of power. The sort of thing that was successful in 19th century Europe under the Congress of Vienna, which, by the way, Henry Kissinger wrote his PhD about. Until he wrote the book on China, he was a German geopolitical realist. He's now either lost the plot because of advancing years, or he's been bought. The balance of power, in which power is balanced between the powers. We had it in the Cold War. It was quite simple but dangerous between two powers, the Soviet Union and the United States, Warsaw Pact and NATO. Or the sort of power we might be moving towards, a multipolar balance of power, particularly predominant with China and the United States, but with other major powers playing a substantial role. Obviously a rise in India, although it's a fair way behind China, to say the least. A Japan that is damaged, but which you've heard me say still has strong innovation and a significant military capability, that we in Australia now are Japan's second most military relationship, and we're going to do more. And there are other elements in the balance. You can talk about Russia, although I don't much these days, a power that's busted, but which has a long history of bouncing back, but it's going to take a long time. It has some very serious deficiencies, which I won't go into, but you can ask about. Balances of power work if there is a common understanding about the risks and limits of power, and importantly, if one power doesn't appease, some would say accommodate, the other. Is there a concept in which the United States and its allies, including Australia, Japan, and South Korea, which are essentially maritime countries, maritime allies, in which we're used to operating on the high seas, and in which we have very advanced capabilities both above, on and under the water. So could you conceive of in this balance the United States and its allies as maritime allies? And on the other hand, and that's, if you like, the Washington consensus, what's called the democratic free enterprise model of capitalism and democracy. And on the other hand, what's called the Beijing consensus, the authoritarian state capitalism model, which has been very successful, and that might include China and Russia, who are members, by the way, of the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which, in my view, doesn't amount to much. It includes those two countries and the stands of Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Makes a very neat geopolitical little model, a bunch of maritime countries and a bunch of continental countries. I wouldn't push that model very far because I think there are enormous hidden tensions between China and Russia that will not, that relationship will not last very long. Are we already seeing alignments as China's power rises and as in recent couple of years it started to use power more and as people are getting more concerned, are we seeing already shifting alignments where countries such as Australia are taking a hedge against the risk of China's growing power? And I refer you to our Defence White Paper and what it said. And why do you think we might get, under this government, and I don't know about the opposition because they don't have a defence policy, why do you think we're going to double our submarine force to 12 as distinct from 6? Why do you think we would be building the world's biggest conventional submarines at closer to 5,000 tonnes than the Collins class 3,000? And why would it have air-independent propulsion? And why would it have Tomahawk land attack cruise missile capable of targeting hardened targets at great distance in a moderate way? Well, there's only one answer. Is Japan doing more in terms of its military capabilities? Yes, it is. It certainly was until the earthquake and tsunami, when I was in Japan talking to people there about their military capabilities. Why do you think Japan is developing an anti-submarine warfare capability to detect Chinese submarines in the island chain, in the Okinawa Ryukyu's island chain? Well, I think the answer is fairly obvious. What about other powers such as South Korea? Why is it acquiring submarines and air warfare destroyers with the Aegis air combat system on board, the world's most advanced American system for shooting down aircraft when you're on a ship? Well, it sure as hell isn't to fight some country called North Korea, in my view. So I say that we're already seeing alignment shift. Hopefully, if we are subject to a competitive balance of power, two things might ameliorate that we haven't seen before. The first one is nuclear weapons and the risk of the use of them, and I'm perfectly convinced that the Chinese, like the Soviets before them, perfectly understand the risks of nuclear war, and that will be a limitation, hopefully, on any military competition or, more dangerously, escalation. The second concept is one that one of my colleagues is in favour of, a concert of power in Asia. Let me remind you, a concert of power in Europe was what happened at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. It arose out of the defeat of Napoleon's France. It brought all the major powers together. It did not humiliate France. And the boast is that the concert of Europe brought about peace for 100 years until 1914 and the First World War. Well, no, it didn't. I mean, if you care to put to one side the Franco-Prussian War between France and Prussia in 1870, more seriously, if you want to put to one side the Crimean War, in which, if you please, high Protestant England, Catholic France, and Islamic Turkey fought Orthodox Russia. And it wasn't a side war. 750,000 dead, 500,000 Russians. And despite the agreement of the Concert of Europe to not humiliate powers after battle, Russia was very much humiliated. The Black Sea Fleet was ordered to be destroyed, and as a result, Russia expanded into Central Asia and knocked on the door of Afghanistan familiar, and grabbed Chinese territory in the Siberia-Russian Far East. There were geopolitical implications of the breakdown, as far as I'm concerned, of the concert of Europe. The Congress of Vienna also was able to be formed because there was a common European culture, a common European understanding. Do I see a common nation culture, a common nation understanding, including on security matters? No, I do not. And what I do see in our region is rising nationalisms, edgy territorial claims and interests, and frankly, and my colleague Professor Desmond Ball has written about this, and Desmond is always careful on these issues, he now sees elements of arms racing in North Asia, particularly in the maritime, that is, naval and air warfare capability. I'm going to go on to the third one, but before I do, I would acknowledge that many of my colleagues, and particularly in international relations, would say there is a fourth model, and that's called the economic interdependence model. But here we are in this globalised economic interdependent world, not least in Asia, not least with America and China, you know, where iPods assembled, not made, where iPods assembled, where iPads assembled in China, where it's almost everything assembled in China. That because of this, it would be disastrous if America went to war with China. And there's obviously some truth in that. But those of you who know your history will know that we heard that argument before. In 1911, 1909, a man called Norman Angell wrote a book called The Great Illusion that said it would be disastrous for Germany that was so interdependent in economics, in trade, in immigration, in the royal family connections, in tourism. It would be disastrous for Germany to go to war with Britain. And guess what happened? But it is a legitimate argument that needs to be considered. The final one I want to discuss is my favourite, a new regional security architecture. Well, we've got the alphabet soup of security architecture in Asia, and my God, don't we have it. We have APEC, we have ASEAN, we have ASEAN +3, we have the ASEAN Regional Forum, we have the East Asia Summit, we have the six-party talks, and it can go on and on and on. You might ask, how much progress has been made? Well, let me tell you. Gareth Evans, when he was Foreign Minister, he and I wrote a document called Confidence Building Measures for the ASEAN Regional Forum. And Gareth told me, in that typical way of Gareth, I couldn't use intelligence sharing. That was a naughty word. I had to talk about information sharing. I couldn't use the word transparency. And we proposed all sorts of things for confidence building. That was 18 years ago. ASEAN Regional Forum now is in its 18 years and it's still talking about it. I know because I'm a member of the ASEAN Regional Forum, so-called Expert and Eminent Persons Group. And I've been on 5 of these meetings over 5 years. And in each of those meetings I proposed that we have an avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement. Can I repeat that? An avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement. In 1972, those arch enemies, the Soviet Union and the United States, had such an agreement. You know, you shall not point your missiles at a proximate warship. You shall not train your guns. You should not point laser beams and blind the people on the bridge. As an aircraft carrier or any ship with aircraft is steaming in a line that is crucial for the takeoff and landing, you shall not interfere. Soviet Union, United States. So for 5 years in the ASEAN Regional Forum Expert and Eminent Persons Group, I proposed that, and on each single occasion the Chinese have knocked it back. And you know what the response of the Chinese representative is? Oh, that's not our priority, Paul. China's priority is piracy, international crime, in my language, hugging trees. And my response to the Chinese excellency is, so can you tell me why you're developing nuclear-powered attack submarines? Is that to do with piracy or international crime? You get no answer. So, you know, the problem is that we're going nowhere with this one. And as my colleague Des Ball says, we've got an arms race on our hands. Let me tell you what we've got. Unlike Europe in the Cold War, where there were arms control agreements, intrusive counting rules for ballistic missiles, including at the factory gates, Americans at Soviet factory gates counting the ballistic missiles, intrusive rules for counting tanks, artillery, submarines, warships. We have no such agreements at all. With no open skies agreement, no avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement. And that's happening, as Kevin Rudd pointed out in one of his first speeches as Prime Minister, this time he was right, that's happening while the arms race is building up. And it is not a very nice picture. It's one fraught with dangers and difficulties. I'm going to finish now, but before I do, while I'm talking about this concept of a regional security organisation, Henry Kissinger, in this book of his on China, 535 pages, beautifully written, beautifully written. He, in the last 2.5 pages, he comes up with the idea of a Pacific community. So out of 535 pages, we get 2.5 pages. Brilliant. Very well thought through. Not. And what's he talking about? Well, it's not very clear in 2.5 pages, but that there would be a common enterprise between China and the United States with shared purposes. It would not be a bloc, but it would be joint endeavours. Well, what the hell does that mean? I mean, if we're not getting anywhere with all these things I and others have been involved in 17 years, when we can't even get to first base about an avoidance of naval incidents at sea agreement, when there's nasty things going on the South China Sea, the East China Sea and the Yellow Sea, then we've got a slight problem, Henry. But, you know, he floats it, 2.5 pages out of 535. Good read, not? Okay, in conclusion, you can see I'm more optimistic about challenging the rise and rise of China. I think it has some weaknesses. And this might be the wishes of the father of the thought. I'm more optimistic about America bouncing back. But I recognise I'm challengeable and may well be in the minority. But I am pessimistic, not optimistic, as you can see, about tempering what could be a dangerous competition between the rising power and the status quo power. And they're both ambitious, self-centred, strong powers. So if I had a wish list, it would be to rapidly advance confidence-building measures and arms control measures, including intrusive inspections, to build up mutual transparency and conflict avoidance measures. However, we have been discussing for 11 years in the ASEAN Regional Forum not just military confidence-building measures, preventive diplomacy. And we now, after 11 years, have a work plan, a modest work plan for preventive diplomacy. And so you see, the risk is that the arms build-up and the lack of transparency and arms control measures is we're going to run out of time. So if we run out of time, we'll be left with, I'm afraid, the dangerous alternative, from my point of view, of the balance of power. Some will say it will be moderated by economic interdependence. I hope that's the case. Some, like me, will say that in the end it will be moderated by the fear of using nuclear weapons. Now, in case you think I've been very pessimistic, here's a really pessimistic note on which to end. I was at a conference 2 weekends ago called the Australian Davos Leadership Retreat. It's not Davos. And I can't give you the names of who said what, but I can give you the gist of what our concerns were. There were very serious discussions in that meeting, mainly businessmen and women and economists, and a few of us security wonks. Very serious discussions about the state of the American economy, even more serious discussions about the state of the European Union economy. On balance, people were optimistic, but there wasn't a huge difference, 60-40, optimism, pessimism. And I pointed out to the meeting, if Western democratic capitalism is in crisis, if it is, and we had sessions, by the way, on is there a crisis of capitalism? If the West is in that crisis, and I hope it's not, then what I've said, you've got to really add very substantially to. Why? Because the last time in history that I recall, where there was a serious global crisis in Western capitalism, at the same time as there was a tectonic shift in the balance of power, was in the 1930s, and we all know how that ended up. Thank you.
This is a question seeking reassurance. Suppose I was a Vietnamese seeking reassurance from you that Vietnam, sitting next to China, will not go the same way as Mexico, sitting next to America. Why is it that Australia won't become like Ecuador? We ship iron ore, Ecuador ships bananas, economic leverage is all. Can you give us the optimistic, perhaps counterintuitive answer to that?
No, don't. Look, Vietnam, 1,000 years under Chinese suzerainty, as you well know. They've never forgotten that. And I can't remember whether you were here, Doug, but I was criticising Kissinger's book, in which the chapter which you should read on the Vietnam, when China was teaching Vietnam lesson, Kissinger claims China won. No, it didn't. I think, Vietnam, I've been there a few times and helped develop what was called 1.5 tracks for foreign affairs there in '96. It is a proud, nationalist, successful country that has saw off the French and the Americans, and how. I think the way they're buying Russian military equipment, not least submarines, Doug, tells us something. The way they're encouraging ship visits and maybe port rights by the Americans and certainly the Indians, it's significant of this shift in alignment that where countries are reacting to what China's done in the last couple of years. As to Australia, well, we were the Banana Republic, weren't we? I don't know whether we're Ecuador or Cuba or something, but I must say I don't buy the argument of some of my colleagues, Doug, says he carefully, that America and indeed its allies should accommodate China. Accommodate starts to smack a bit, and I reluctantly use this word, appease. And secondly, I think we will have to run a dual policy, which will be enormously difficult, given that China is, and will be more so, our dominant economic power, and that America will remain our ally. We will never have an alliance with China unless China becomes a democracy. I mean, for once, I actually agree with John Howard, who last week on TV said it's values that separate us. It is values. But I think a dual policy on Australia's part, which is carefully modulated, which is engagement with China amongst the whole range of economic, trade, military, intelligence, cultural, human rights issues, but in which, much more carefully than we said in the white paper, we have an element of hedging along with our American ally, is probably the way it's going to go, I think. Bill, did you have your hand up?
Oh, I did. I'm interested in your read on the flashpoints of the Asia Pacific. Balkans starting World War I, Poland, or whatever, and Taiwan and the Korean Peninsula.
Yeah.
In particular, a lot of strategists are saying, well, China's actually being fairly concentrated in its development of naval capabilities in terms of moving towards a position where it can contest American power in some type of a future showdown in Taiwan. In terms of the Korean Peninsula, is problematic as an ally, although we're trying to say they have allies. As problematic of an ally as North Korea might be, nevertheless, it seemed to me to be pretty hard to envision China standing by if there's an implosion of the North. You had the same issue with the Americans up at the Yalu or whatever. So I just wondered, I'd be very interested in your read of how the flashpoints problem figures in the overall power balance that you anticipate in the absence of confidence building measures.
Yeah. I mean, I think the ones that have been very high profile recently in the South China Sea, the incidents I've mentioned, in the East China Sea, the incidents I've mentioned, and even in the Yellow Sea, when China tried to stop America deploying the aircraft carrier battle group at George Washington. I mean, as if a great power is going to avoid doing that. By the way, I might mention, because I haven't mentioned this, there is an interesting law of the sea difference between China and the United States. Remember that America is not a signatory to the law of the sea. Is that right, Bill? Yeah. They've not ratified it, whereas we have. The Western interpretation of law of the sea, and of course it's a Western model, not a Chinese one, is that countries have sovereignty in the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, but in the 200-mile exclusive economic zone, we, the Americans and Allies, reserve the right to push our warships through without permission. The Chinese do not accept that, and that is going to be, and has been, I think, a big issue, particularly given their claims for the, as far as we can see, the entirety of the South China Sea and the islands in any case, and that generate 200-mile exclusive economic zones. To Taiwan, the latest Pentagon document released a few weeks ago points to the build-up of the Chinese forces, particularly, a deluge of intermediate-range ballistic missiles, which are, as I understand it, getting increasingly accurate, and combat aircraft. But its bottom line is that China still lacks the capability, credibly, to mount a full-scale assault on Taiwan. And it makes the very interesting point, which I underlined, Bill, that China does not have the ability to mount a blockade of Taiwan's ports against a major power, against the United States. Again, you see, it tells you about the difference in the power situation. I mean, Taiwan is the issue that none of us want to face up to, frankly. I mean, we support the two-China policy. We don't want to crucify our relationships with China on the... is this mood lighting? On the relationship that we have with Taiwan. You know better than me that increasingly it seems to me the Chinese are, to be fair, being very patient about Taiwan. They're no longer rattling the weapons system all the time. How many Taiwanese are working in China? Is it a couple of million? Just across the straits in factories that, do all this high-tech stuff and so on. So that's perhaps one where even I, Bill, would agree with economic interdependence being an inhibitor. The Korean Peninsula, I mean, you just wish that North Korea would go away, but for China, and you alluded to it, if North Korea should collapse like East Germany, by the way, the western part of Germany is still getting over the costs, as I understand it, of incorporating the eastern part, and the Korean thing would be much more expensive. And the lack of interchange and so on, it's a totally different thing altogether compared with East Germany. That if you're a Chinese, what you don't want is a North Korea that becomes part of South Korea. And don't tell me the South Koreans wouldn't love to have nuclear weapons. Yes, they would. We all know which the target would be, a place called Japan. And that China does not want to see the risk of American troops, as you said, on the Yellow River. So the status quo, in many ways, as difficult as North Korea is, sort of works. A collapse of North Korea would be hell let loose. Just coming back to Taiwan, I've often argued this in private, that, if China attacks Taiwan, not because of a Taiwanese declaration of independence, because China's had enough, patience ran out, attacks Taiwan, and American troops in and around Taiwan are being killed, and America invokes the ANZUS Treaty, believe you me, the ANZUS Treaty says, in the event of an attack on either of the high contracting parties, their territories, their troops, their aircraft and vessels in the Pacific area, we shall immediately consult. Doesn't say we shall necessarily do it. My concern has always been that we would be the only country that America could even look to give assistance, because the following countries would not be in a war between China and Taiwan: Japan, South Korea, all the ASEAN countries lined up together are not worth much in military terms in any case. Germany, I don't think so. France, I don't think so. Italy, I don't think so. And even the country I was born in, who loves a war, any war, remember the Falkland Islands? I think the Poms might say no, thanks. And where would that leave us? On the barbed wire fence yet again.
There's always Ecuador. I've got three questions lined up. 1, 2, 3, 4.
please.
Yoko Iroma has been this year's visiting fellow here. I'm originally from Tokyo. As a Japanese, I found it difficult to digest the first part of your presentation, which I found, all of it I found very fascinating, but it was about the danger of overestimating China. Yes, if I put it that way. And the second part was about the importance of balancing China. Now, and your analogy of 1930s was also not very helpful. What should have, I guess we're in a sort of position of Great Britain, seeing Germany rising, but we are aging and declining power, although we do hold a very important international position still. So what should have UK done? Was Munich wrong? Should they have confronted Germany already in Rhineland? And our resources are limited.
You mean our being Japan?
Yes,
yeah.
Yes. Where should we put it in? That's going to be a very difficult choice because we are aging and all these costs of rebuilding after the tsunami. Where should we put our resources? What's more difficult? How should we balance the overestimation and overcommitment and underestimation?
Yeah. Here's a question for you, Professor.
Dead easy.
You've got 3 minutes.
Thank you. I think it's very difficult for Japan, as you say, ageing population, 2 decades of stagnation, so you've got 2 options. You can accommodate and appease China, which is effectively what Britain and particularly France did with the Rhineland in the Second World War. Or you can join a balance of power with your great and powerful allies, which is in fact what you're doing. I mean, you look at what you're doing with us. We now have with you a military logistics resupply arrangement. We're now discussing with your officials in Tokyo an intelligence sharing arrangement, if we can trust your politicians, by the way. For the first time in your history, we've had our F-18 combat aircraft using an airbase, I forget its name, in your country. We've worked alongside you in Cambodia, East Timor, and we guided your troops building a railway in Iraq. So I think we've come a long way. I don't underestimate the difficulties you face. I was in Japan, as my family knows, the afternoon of the earthquake in Tokyo. Do you know what was fantastic was the dignity with which your people conducted themselves. There was no panic, none of that. The only thing that broke down was the mobile phone system, which was overloaded. I think, that's going to divert you. It's going to cost $300 billion US or whatever it is. By the way, as a proportion of GDP, that's less than the cost for New Zealand. You know that one. Certainly when I was talking at Vice Foreign Minister level, I think even with this left-wing government of yours, there is a desire to increase your military capabilities. You remember I mentioned the submarine detection capability, the SOSUS array, and the other things you're discussing.
What about anti-ballistic missile defense? How important do you think that is?
I think for you it's important. I think, the Patriot 3 and the Aegis system, the SAM-6s, are important, and SM-6s, and you should go ahead with that. I think it's very difficult for you because the instinct could be, just roll over and let it happen. And we all know what happens to countries that do that.
Colleagues, we will finish on time because we'll have business and things to get to. It's almost 10:07. Up here.
Yeah, Dr. John Waxman, STSC. Professor Dibb, thank you for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, neighbour.
Always entertaining, I have to say. And always you have some compelling arguments to make. You made an interesting observation about Armand's article in Foreign Affairs, the latest edition, which, and your criticism of his conclusions, I think, are very reasonable. But you didn't address his argument in the body of his article, which I found reasonably compelling. He talked about the projection of Chinese growth at perhaps reducing from 10 to 7%, and US economic growth optimistically going from 2.5% to maybe, if we're lucky, 3.5%. And even if that is the case, at about 2030, China will still outpace the United States. that concerns me. Obviously, it concerns a lot of us. And you, in your presentation, you talked about issues that you wouldn't consider, or that we might have to reconsider if things change. I wonder if you could give us, just for a couple of minutes, your thoughts on how we might have to reconsider if that does happen.
I mean, those figures, again, are based on, an optimistic view of China's growth, and he claims they're moderate. Well, they're not moderate because they're the same as the Central Planning Agency, the Politburo in China, which is based on 7%. My concern is that people like John Lee and others I know, David Hale in the United States, are saying there is a real risk that China could have a dramatic slowdown, much more than 10 to 7%, if not some sort of explosion in the housing boom and so on. And, the answer to the people who do these extrapolations is, how good were we 10 years ago making judgments, It's a useful discipline, by the way, including for intelligence people. When we're looking forward in defence planning terms, 20 or 30 years into the future, go back 20 or 30 years and see how many things we got wrong, with the end of the Cold War, with 9/11, with Iraq and Afghanistan. I do accept, who would have believed that with the end of world history, as Francis Fukuyama called it, in which, the only successful model was Western democratic capitalism, that would be in this sort of, not just economic, but economic and political crisis in the West, leadership crisis. I think the issues of what we would face if he is right, you remember his measures of the success of a great power were very crude economic ones. They were GDP, trade and debt. Well, he chose debt because it suited, as long as America is the reserve currency, there's a problem with that sort of debt they've got, but they can actually just keep printing the currency. So we can speculate on, if he's right, then would everything that I've said be a lot worse, to which the answer probably is, like with the answer to Japan, yes.
My name is Albert Lee. I'm from the Department of Nuclear Physics, ANU.
Department of
Nuclear Physics.
Ah!
I just want to make a comment. Well, we all know that the four great inventors of ancient China's compass, paper, printing, and gunpowder. And if you want to look at the parallels of those inventions in the modern world, so I think the four great inventions of the modern world are the aeroplane, the computer, the internet, and the nuclear bomb.
Yeah.
And I think if, unless a country can't take these four areas of invention to the next level, I don't think we can see a next space program.
I'll take that as a comment. Are you doing things that we need to know about? Well, the Dean needs to know.
It's another Dean that has to worry about. This will be our final question.
Thank you very much, Professor Bibb. I'm Don Hai from the PhD student for 2 years, Strategic Defense Studies Center, which is on the 4th floor. And I'm from Vietnam. I'm very impressed by your presentations, and I have a question from the smaller countries' perspective, because what we learn from history, Vietnamese history, that competition of powers is not good. Because anyone who have to choose side, and it's happened in Vietnam that the proxy war happened there, and tragedy happened, and we don't even either hegemonic power as 100,000 years before. In the Vietnam history, we have the Chinese, the dominant power, and Vietnamese people who live by the way that they deference, and one way that they recognize the status of China as the big power, big neighbor power, but then they try to keep autonomy inside. But the situation now is quite, it's very hard for the policy, makers to decide whether they decide to, in favor to sign up with China or US, or whether they have to sign up with, sign up with ASEAN for a long time, that couldn't prevent China assisting in the South China Sea. And if you leave just near China is also a big puzzle for the policy, because all the time, so not only the pressures on the sea, but also pressure from different directions as well, because just near the big power, also the economic relationships, so all type of relationships depend on that. Is there any way out of that? Is there any way out of the geopolitical competitions? And if you are a Vietnamese leader, what do you choose?
You'd have to pay me a lot of money.
We will.
I think it's very hard, if I might say so, and I don't mean this in a...
Price just went up.
Prices went up? Thank you. I think it's very hard, if I might say so, for people like me who grew up... I grew up in England, an island. I've lived here 45 years or more. Anglo-Saxon countries, in their origins, are island countries. Britain, Australia, New Zealand. And even, you know, when you look at America, I mean, it's an island really. I mean, is Canada a threat? I don't think so. Is Mexico? I don't think so. And we've never had a history, certainly not Britain, Australia, New Zealand, of being invaded. I mean, the last time Britain was 1066. By the way, the last time the Americans was when we British set fire to the White House in 1812. So we don't share long common land borders where war has occurred. I mean, when I talk to Russians, they absolutely understand that. When I talk to Germans, they absolutely understand that. You understand it. 1,000 years of Chinese suzerainty, and despite being fraternal communist countries, in 1978, China decides to teach you a lesson. So I think the issue for you and your survival is the issue of middle powers. And I've mentioned, you know, South Korea, I've mentioned Vietnam, I've mentioned Australia. And by the way, I think in ASEAN, I'm glad to see, after almost an absence of 10 years, for reasons I understand, with Indonesia preoccupied with building democracy, which it's doing in a way that Russia in the same period has absolutely not done, that in my impression at ASEAN meetings in the last 2 years, I'm seeing a more confident Indonesia. And I think that's good. We Australians certainly want to see the world's largest Muslim country, fourth largest democracy, just off our northern shore, being more confident. And if I were you in ASEAN, although I know there are substantial weaknesses in ASEAN, I'd be doing more together, that is you in the north and Indonesia in the south, to try and get some more backbone into ASEAN. ASEAN talks a lot and doesn't do much. Finally, on South China Sea, there's not much you can do except do what you're doing with your Kilo-class submarines and other military equipment, and frankly, prevail on the Americans. You won't need to prevail on them, to ensure that freedom of the high seas, including through the South China Sea, is an American interest, because you can't do that by yourself.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking Paul for